Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining, and sorry to start a little bit late. We are still waiting for more people. I think some people are trying to get in through security, and so they'll just join us when they're able to. And thank you for joining us today, especially. It's a Friday, and it's earlier in the morning, so appreciate it. But maybe that'll give us an opportunity to have more kind of reflective and intimate conversation on the topic. And it's a really important topic, especially for today's world, as millions are struggling to find their voice and address oppression and injustice. Of course, we know that history is filled with examples of the devastating consequences of oppression, but it also provides profound insights on how to deal with oppression and how to address injustice. Actions that don't deepen divisions, but instead seek to build higher levels of unity and pathways towards lasting peace and justice. Oppression, whether it's political or religious or social, has often been met with resistance. And today we really want to talk about what that resistance looks like. What does it look like to address injustice? Do we respond also with the same level of force that is used against us, or is there another way, one that transcends hatred, retribution, and the desire to defeat an adversary at all costs? Martin Luther King Jr., who led one of the most powerful movements against racial injustice, reminded us that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And his words remind us that the most enduring struggles for justice and peace have not been won through violence, but through the power of principled, peaceful action. When we resist oppression with love, dignity, discipline, and nonviolent action, we do more than oppose justice. We disarm it, and we create the conditions for real and lasting peace. Gandhi, whose movement also led to the liberation of India from colonial rule, taught us that the means we use to fight injustice must be as pure as the ends that we seek. So if we seek a world of peace, dignity, and human rights, we cannot build it on the foundations of hatred and retribution. And there's a scholar of conflict transformation, Michael Karlberg, who you may know, and he's articulated the importance of not only resisting oppression, but actually actively creating new ways, new structures, new alternatives of building structural and moral frameworks at the level of the individual, the community, and the institutions, and the relationships between these three protagonists in ways that stand in stark contrast with structures that perpetuate violence. There are many, many examples of peaceful responses to oppression, which we'll hear about from our distinguished speakers today. But one of the clearest examples of the approach to injustice has been a community that our organization works with closely, which is the Bahá'í community in Iran, who's the largest religious minority in the country, who has faced systematic oppression and persecution for 45 years. Yet in the face of this injustice, they have chosen a path of constructive resilience. So despite facing executions, torture, imprisonment, being denied university education in Iran, they have never taken up violence against the Iranian government, and in fact have always sought their rights through peaceful and constructive means, while also contributing to the well-being of their communities, their neighborhoods, and their country. While the Iranian government has spread hate against them, labeling them as others in their own land and inciting people to use violence against the Baha'is in Iran, the Baha'is have launched many campaigns in recent years, a campaign called An Iran Without Hate, and Our Story is One, to show that despite decades of hate and division that's been spread by the Iranian government, that Baha'is want to stand for unity and to work shoulder to shoulder with their compatriots and want to build an Iran where everyone can live without hate, regardless of their gender, faith, ethnicity, or social class. This has led millions of people in Iran to rise up in their support. because they have seen in action that the hate propaganda of the Iranian government has been completely baseless. So even though the government tried to eradicate the Baha'i community from Iran entirely, the Baha'i community has not only been maintained, it has grown, and it has been able to strengthen its own community, but also foster a spirit of service and unity among the population. A letter that was addressed to the Baha'is in Iran described their approach in these words: "You have demonstrated in the example of your lives that the proper response to oppression is neither to succumb in resignation nor to take on the characteristics of the oppressor. The victim of oppression can transcend it through an inner strength that shields the soul from bitterness and hatred and which sustains consistent principled action." Of course, this week is CSW, and we know that women are another group that have faced oppression and persecution in society, not only decades, but many centuries. And despite facing the legal, economic, and systematic barriers, women have led movements for peace, for justice, education, and equality through peaceful and constructive means. From the suffragists who fought for the right to vote to the countless women who have mobilized for peace in conflict-ridden societies, their leadership has demonstrated that strength and courage are not defined by force, but by perseverance, moral clarity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And this is not because women are inherently passive, but because their exclusion from traditional power structures has often required them to develop alternative, inclusive strategies for change. So our four speakers today are going to help us navigate this topic and help us understand and kind of dive deeper into to the discussion on this subject. And without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Mr. Felix Maradiaga. Felix is a prominent figure in Central America, known for his expertise in nonviolent resistance and democracy building. As a human rights advocate and thought leader in nonviolent resistance strategy, he's widely recognized as one of the leading voices in Nicaragua. He currently serves as a board trustee at Freedom House and holds an academic position as professor of the practice of global democracy at the University of Virginia. He also founded an organization, I'm going to completely mispronounce this, but a Fundación para la Libertad de Nicaragua. You can fix it, I'm sorry. A nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting private solutions to public policy challenges. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you for this invitation. And I'd like to start with an anecdote. In 2007, after 10 years of civil service running the country's Office for Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Disarmament, I was invited to the Toledo Center for Peace to launch a new academic venture, which was the first center in Central America to teach nonviolence at a university-accredited institution. While visiting Toledo, Spain, I took a little bit of free time to walk that beautiful city, and I learned that during medieval times, Toledo actually was a place where Catholic, Jews, the Islam, they all learned from each other to work together to translate classical texts. And I reflect on the question, what happened to us? What happened to the spirit of coexistence, even in medieval times, the interfaith dialogue that we had? And today, despite remarkable technological progress and global interconnectedness, humanity faces trouble in democratic decline. Freedom House, an organization that I deeply admired, has been doing for over 40 years the Freedom in the World Report, and for 19 consecutive years, we've seen a wave of democratic backsliding. Today, 80% of the world population live in some sort of autocracy. As per Freedom House category, either a not free country, which is a dictatorship basically, or a hybrid regime. And Nicaragua is one of them. It's one of the most repressive regimes in Latin America. And as a survivor of brutal repression by Daniel Ortega's regime in Nicaragua, I have personally experienced the consequences of speaking truth to power and speaking up for democracy and human rights. I was subject to 611 days of degrading conditions, inhumane treatment that remained up until today very difficult to share publicly. But I do have these sort of panels and platforms, so I use my time not to explain my own open wounds. I need to deal with that, and I see Azadeh Afsahi here, who actually is a trauma expert. I love to follow up the conversation, but I use this platform to speak for those who are not here. Thousands in Latin America, millions of political prisoners in the world, many of them women, that do not have these platforms. And what I saw in Nicaragua is incredibly similar to what I witnessed in Ukraine. Right after 2 years of arbitrary detention, I went to Ukraine and I spoke, and this is only an example, to people who had survived hostage taking in Russia, and their testimonies were incredibly similar to what I heard in Nicaragua, or what I've heard about people who had been imprisoned in Belarus or Cuba or Venezuela, as my work at the Ending Arbitrary Detention Initiative at the University of Virginia, where we try to understand the use of arbitrary detention for political reasons as a political weapon used by regime. So sadly, my case is not unique. Not only in my country, but around the world, journalists, human rights defenders, feminists, intellectuals, they are arrested and they are subject to inhumane treatment. During my imprisonment, all fundamental rights were stripped. I was not allowed access to a lawyer. Even my case that was supposed to be held in public was conducted inside the prison. And when you are denied of even a phone call, every writing or reading materials, any access to the outside world, where the only connection with the outside world were the long interrogations in which you had some idea what was happening outside based on the questions of the interrogators. The only thing that I had with me was my faith. So my faith was my lifeline with the outside world. And my wife launched an international campaign called A Bible for Felix, basically asking for a Bible, which was never granted. And I was never allowed to pray out loud. It was even forbidden to even conduct prayer in out loud. And this is another finding, which is how these regimes fear faith. And they fear faith precisely because they know that many spiritual traditions find their strength in spirituality. And as we know, those of us who believe in nonviolence, that nonviolence is not weakness, it is moral and spiritual strength. In my case, this conviction is rooted in my faith, which teaches that love and meekness possess greater transformative power than the sword. In my personal faith, I believe the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, in which he said that bless the peacemakers, and he called us to love even our enemies. And we see that this is not unique to Christianity. Judaism contributes the concept of tikkun olam, which is the repair of the world. Hebrew prophets envision a day when nations would no longer raise swords against each other. We see as well the tradition in Islam, similarly, that emphasizes justice and compassion as central virtues. The Bahá'í tradition teaches that world peace begins with peace in the heart of each individual. Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, teach that all beings are interconnected, recognizing our unity and compassion as something that builds a peaceful humanity. Thus, we confirm unequivocally an ancient thread running through spirituality across ages and cultures and across traditions that rejects what today we define as human rights violations. In that sense, any use of religious arguments to trample the rights of women, to trample the rights of peaceful advocates, to trample the rights of intellectuals is nothing but a perversion of faith. There's no justification to use religion to persecute minorities or to persecute any member of a society. At the same time, faith-based organizations and believers cannot invoke and should not invoke passivity or ignorance. That's the other face of the coin. We cannot use our religion not to be fully engaged in social justice and the pursuit of freedom. Some who best articulated this civic responsibility were, of course, John Paul II, Martin Luther King, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who before his martyrdom in the hands of the Nazis declared silence in the face of injustice is complicity. People of faith are called to respond actively with love, justice, and mercy, for true faith does not tolerate indifference to human suffering. These spiritual teachings universally reject violation of human dignity and human rights abuses committed under the guise of religion. However, today, over 78 countries around the world imprison people for their political beliefs. We see this in China, North Korea, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and many others, systematically restricting religious freedoms. Women disproportionately suffer under these regimes where spirituality and religion is distorted as a tool for oppression. In Nicaragua, for example, half the Catholic clergy has been forced into exile. Bishops and religious leaders have been imprisoned. Protestant denominations and evangelical missions, such as Corner of Love, for example, has been forced into exile. 5,700 nonprofits have been shut down. About a third of them are faith-based organizations. As we gather here at the 69th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, it is critical for me to highlight that this persecution is particularly vicious against religious women, such as the case of Nicaragua, Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity, who were persecuted, properties were confiscated, and they were expelled and forced into exile in Nicaragua. Similar abuses happen globally in the world, and Iran is a prime example of that. I'd like to remind that my good friend Mazi Alinejad today is seeing the trial of two of the persons who tried to kill her in the US. And we see that this persecution is not only happening inside their borders, but dictators try to impose their rules even outside of their borders through transnational repression. However, we see that dictatorships work together, but faith-based organizations are not necessarily working together. So my appeal is for interfaith dialogue, interfaith collaboration. In building these alliances, faith-based organizations are indispensable actors. Defending religious freedom is fundamental to global efforts to halt democratic regression. Faith-based organizations can significantly contribute to establishing constructive agency, renewing our hope in nonviolence. Conversely, once again, any use of religion to oppress, any use of religion to silence, to persecute, and violate fundamental rights must be denounced as a perversion of authentic spirituality. Of course, I do not suggest at all that only believers can firmly hold a spirituality promoting nonviolence or goodness. Certainly not. Indeed, religion freedom must be viewed as both the right to believe and the right not to believe. Constructive agency involves acting with wisdom and empathy, transcending mere visceral reaction. As John Paul II affirmed, there is no peace without justice, no justice without forgiveness, and following this spirit, our task must focus on reconciliation and healing rather than vengeance and division. Finally, let us remember that each of us is a guardian of freedom and justice in our own environment. Our responsibility is not only to defend freedom abstractly, but to live it fully. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I was just wondering, you talked about the role of faith-based actors in promoting peace in the face of violence. I was just wondering, in your experience in Nicaragua and nonviolent movements, why do you think it's important to take a peaceful stance in the face of violence and oppression? What's been your experience with that?
Authoritarian dictators are by nature bullies. And some of them might be verbal bullies, some of them might use the judicial system, the power of the state, others use violence in more direct, perverse, extreme ways. So they control this territory. They control the field. That's where they feel more comfortable at. But when you, as an activist, as a human rights defender, remain within the territory of ideas, of justice, of international law, they do not know how to play that. So if we resort to violence, basically we move to their territory where they have the advantage of weapons, they have the advantage of the repressive state apparatus. And having said that, I'm not speaking in nonviolence in an extreme passive way, but nonviolence as a political strategy as well. And one of the organizations, and I fully agree that the women's organizations are particularly smart in not resorting to violence, but also faith-based organizations, because of their spiritual traditions, are very, I would say, very efficient in using nonviolence as a strategy to social change, which is something that dictators around the world have troubles to fight back.
Thank you very much. We'll have more time for questions as well. So now we move to our actually virtual speaker. Her name is, again, I know that I will not be doing justice to your name, but I will do my best. Her name is Katarzyna Przybyła, who's an expert in peace and conflict studies, international security, and nonviolence resistance. She leads the Strategic Peace and Conflict Studies program at Collegium Civitas in collaboration with UNITAR, and serves as an associate editor for Peace Review. And she is joining us from Warsaw. Thank you so much for joining us today. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. So my name is Katarzyna Przybyła. I know, extremely complicated to pronounce. And it was a great pleasure to listen to the first speaker. I want to start with a few words about my positionality. So I consider myself a peace and conflict studies enthusiast. So I'll be speaking from the PAC's perspective. And I am from Central Europe, from Poland, and my work is focused on Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. So I'll be sharing experiences from this particular region. Every region has its own stories of resistance, resilience, fighting against oppression and injustice. We do not have time for all the stories here, but let me just share with you a few stories of social transformation, social change done through non-violent action and means. And then lessons learned from these stories, supported by research. At the end of 20th century, in Central and Eastern Europe, that was the time of transformation and people power. Now imagine, you can even close your eyes, people in 3 countries holding hands and forming a human chain, connecting not just people in 1 country, but in 3 countries as a response to the systemic oppression. This is not just a dream. These are the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and their often underestimated singing revolution that led to their country's independence. Now, imagine 1/4 of citizens of your own country forming a nonviolent movement. Not 1%, not 3%, but almost 25% of people united, feeling power, expressing their agency. This is Poland's Solidarity Movement, one of the biggest non-violent resistant movements in the world, that started the path to the end of communism in this part of the world. Now imagine a country under occupation. This is a harder case, right? And citizens choosing non-violent action and means to say no to the occupation. This is Ukraine, 2022. People often surprise us with when they choose to act peacefully, even in the darkest times, even in the worst cases and moments. They also surprise us when they do not act when we expect them to act. The question is, why? Why people are not using their agency, and how we can help rediscover their agency. Because let me be clear here, we all have agency. I think it's important to underline that. We all have agency. Sometimes we just have to discover it or rediscover it. Of course, the answer to the question is very complex, like why people are not using their power, agency, and make social changes. Fear is one of the reasons. But this is the reason that is visible, that is on the surface. I truly believe that if we want to see conflict transformation, if we want to see social transformation that is meaningful and lasting, we have to understand and discover under the surface reasons. We have to go deeper. We have to dig deeper. So today I want to highlight 3 elements that we may want to consider, all of which are connected to understanding violence as a way to lasting peace. So first, knowledge is crucial. And I know that it sounds like a cliche, but when people do not know what violence is, when people don't know that there are different kinds of violence, from direct through structural and systemic to cultural violence, they may not know that what is happening to them is violence. They may not know that they can take concrete actions, such as, for example, going to court. I teach about violence, and I know that when you put a name to an action, when you finally are able to name what is happening to you, it's often liberating and empowering. It can also be extremely upsetting and devastating, but it can be liberating. This is why education is crucial. Second, overwhelming violence jeopardizes people's ability to resist. And we, as an entire global community, underestimate the effects of violence on people, communities, and nations. Overwhelming violence can take different forms, from shutting down newspapers, state silencing, violent suppression of protests, to, of course, arrests and killings. And usually has been used for a long time. So such overwhelming violence jeopardizes people's ability to resist, jeopardizes people's ability to act peacefully, and jeopardizes even ability to think about a peaceful future. A great example of it is Russia, with high levels of violence, different kinds of violence. So high levels of domestic violence, including violence against women and children, high levels of political violence, and trauma caused by violence transferred from one generation to another for decades, if not centuries. So if you want to see people using their agency, because this is, I guess, it's our desire, right? To see people using their agency for positive social changes, we have to address violence and help people find a way out from the circle of violence. And now, a very important remark: domestic is political. Domestic is political here. And finally, the last point: no peace transformation can happen if there is no place and space for people who share what happened to them. And we are talking about people who have experienced oppression and injustice. Such place and space can take a form of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but it's not limited to it. What is important here is to give people a voice, to acknowledge what happened to them. This is how we can support agency, social transformation, and long-lasting peace. And let me finish with the words of Marian Turski, Holocaust survivor, journalist, historian, in general, an amazing human being who died last month. His advice to fellow human beings, which is, to be honest, the best piece of advice we can get. Was simple. Do not be indifferent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As I listen to each of you, I have questions, but I'll leave them to the end. We go next to someone who's going to speak to this topic from an individual perspective, Ms. Azadeh Afsahi. She's a licensed psychotherapist, human rights advocate, and she focuses on trauma psychology. So she's worked with prisoners and people who have seen torture and persecution, and she will be speaking to us about what it looks like for an individual who has faced oppression and persecution to respond in peaceful ways, even in their own lives, in their inner lives, and what she's seen in her own experience. Please, Azadeh.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Felix, thank you for sharing your experience. I appreciate it. And I know it's not easy. I want to start by asking you to imagine something, because sometimes all we talk about trauma is something that is not tangible. So I want to make it tangible for you to kind of grasp what we do at Iran House and how I approach this trauma-informed work with the survivors. Imagine somebody inflicted pain on you, and now you have your arm that is cut, bleeding, you need medical help, you need stitches, you might need a surgeon. Instead of attending to this wound that is visible, you see it, you go and find the person who did that to you. So what does that do? It prolongs that healing. It doesn't let you focus on what's happening to you right now. It doesn't allow you to seek help. And what happens is that you might lose that arm because it has taken you so long to get the help that you need. Instead, you have focused to hunt down the person, get revenge, and maybe inflict the same violence. But what it doesn't heal your arm. It doesn't get the right help that you need. So what we do in Iran House is that we try to focus on what's have happened to them and take that and empower them to be able to, like Felix said, like the previous speaker mentioned, to allow them that agency, allow them that platform to share their stories. But it doesn't go unnoticed that we have to go deeper. And that deeper goes into what's had happened in our community, what's had happened in our own home, what's had happened in the society that we grew up in. So the past 4 years, I've been working with survivors of torture. I have seen the worst side of humanity. And I always say, once you're in human rights activism work, you see the good, the ugly, and the bad, what humanity can do. And these people are truly broken when they are coming out of prison, when they are no longer in that area of torture. And what happens is that now they are faced with more hurdles in life that they had to go in before they was experienced. I always say they go in being Felix and they come back. They're no longer Felix. Now they have to get to know the new Felix, because they have to get to know what had happened to them and make sense of the world that they have not, the regime or the people have inflicted on them. And it takes time for them to be able to go through that healing process. So in Iran House, what we do is that to create that space for them, because what torture does is strip away a person's from their power, from their dignity, and from their identity. Now they're the new person. Who am I? What are my capabilities? What are my weaknesses, and how can I work towards to be able to fit into this new society that is honestly a cruel place to be? So as we know, violence does not restore what was taken from them. And most survivors know that, thankfully. I don't think I have worked with any survivor that is coming to Iran House or to me says, this is what I want to do. However, they might have thoughts about it, and it's okay for them to have thoughts. Because why it's okay? Because for so long they have been oppressed, and the only thing they had to be able to survive was those thoughts. And when they come out, they can have those thoughts. I give power to that thought. But however, there will always be a thought. For now, when they are out, when they are in a place for them, they can heal, we take those thoughts, and what we do, we give power to that healing side of them, the kind side of them that have been taken away from them. Another thing that we do is to shift their focus from pain to empowerment, and helping the survivor channel their suffering into something that creates change rather than perpetuate their harm. Hence, what is uber important for them to have platforms. One thing that I always do is to bring them into conversation for them to be able to tell their stories, because we read so much of what happened to someone, but actually see it and feel it is very different. Not only for us as a bystander, but also for the survivors, because we give them a platform. We empower that agency within them. And that is actually very healing, because if you think about it, justice, what is justice? Sometimes they don't never get to justice, see the regime that did this to them come to justice. It might take 10 years, but for them to create this, for us to create this platform, give it that little step for them to be able to go on with their daily life. Because ultimately what we want them to heal, to be able to find their way back to normalcy. So storytelling is very important, and a supportive network for them, because often when they come, they are lost. They did have a community inside a prison, obviously, and that community very tight-knitted. And then once they come out, they are extremely lost of where to go and where to seek help. So with Iran House, we have group therapy that has been greatly impactful as they share the same pain, because it's a very particular pain that we cannot understand or fathom. But however, creating that space for them, they can connect and understand each other and work through that experience with each other. What else do we do at Iran House? We acknowledge, we take accountability, and we prevent them for future harm. Because one thing that the Islamic Republic is doing, and I'm talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran because that has been my focus, but I heard that it is anywhere, that they can go after these people. What it can do, and what happens is that they can re-enter that phase of trauma once again, once they are faced with the regime, once they are faced with the bully. So what we do, we create that space for them to be able to have a network. So what if that does happen, they can come back and talk about it. And mostly, it's not magic what we do. We just create a space for them to be able to talk about this, because for so long they have been oppressed. The regime doesn't want you to talk about it. The society absolutely doesn't have a place, because there is a stigma about talking about trauma. So what we do, we create for them to be able to just share it and bring light to what has happened to them. And one thing that I want to point out, that this goes back to that generational trauma. Because as we see this conflict, when there is no peace involved, we have seen it in Israel and Palestine. Does that happen over 76 years, that violence with violence does not solve any solution. We need to make a change, because it goes back to that generational trauma we have all experienced. And at some point, we have to break that cycle, and we do that with trauma-informed healing. And before I end, I would like to share something from the Iranian inside of Iran, Iranian women who are for peace, for love, and for kindness. And this is what they want. And the reason I'm sharing this, because this is an outlet for them to be heard, because sometimes they don't have it. So we extend our congratulations on International Women's Day to all the women and men who strive for equality, freedom, and elimination of discrimination in the world. For us Iranian women who have been fighting for years against the repressive religious regime that deprives women at their most fundamental human and civil rights, this struggle is an ongoing part of our daily lives. Mothers who have lost their children in peaceful protest, killed by the police for their own country, or whose sons and daughters have suffered severe injuries, leave them unable to return to a normal life. Wives who single-handedly bear the heavy burdens of life while also fighting for freedom, justice, and equality. To understand the peak of repression carried out by government forces, one must hear the stories of Imane Karimou, a young woman whose little daughter was ill. As she rushed to get medicine, she saw a wounded young man who had been shot. She stepped forward to help, trying to stop his bleeding with her scarf, only to be shot in the neck and killed. Even in times of war, saving the lives of wounded is considered a humanitarian act. Or consider Nahid Shirpishe, a teacher and a mother who witnessed her son's skull being shattered before her eyes. She was fired from the job she loved and held in solitary confinement in a city for 3 years. A regime that punished a mother simply for asking, for what crime, who killed my son, has subjected her to such unbearable suffering that has attempted suicide. These stories of pain and hardship endured by Iranian women are countless. No matter how much we recount, there will always be another untold story of suffering. We, the women of Iran, send a message of friendship and peace to the people of the world. We hope that one day women everywhere will live in a world free from discrimination, where they can pursue a better and happier life based on their merits. And we hope that the free people of the world will stand in solidarity with our struggle and support us in our fight for our rights. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you also for the letter and showing really what we're talking about in action. Next, we have Ms. Imane Karimou, who's an experienced international development professional specializing in policy and advocacy, currently serving as a UN representative for the organization Nonviolent Peace Force. She also works as a researcher in early warning at the International Crisis Group, and she actively engages in discussions on global peace and security, youth participation in peace building, and strengthening multilateral responses to transnational criminal networks. Thank you for joining us, Imane.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation. Thank you to my co-panelists. It was really fascinating to listen to you guys' remarks. I was equally thrilled to be intervening today because I thought, what a better time to reflect collectively and brainstorm on essentially the question of when faced with escalating violence, and we see that on a global scale today, how do we protect people? How do we respond? How do we protect ourselves without the use of force? Another way to put it is, how do you respond to force? How do you respond to abuse through nonviolent means? That's a very counterintuitive way to go about it, right? And my co-panelists have already hinted to that. So as Simeon stated, I work for an organization that is called Nonviolent Peace Force, which is essentially an organization that is deeply invested in how we can rethink protection, safety, and security in a context of violence. Most often we work in context of mass violence, actually, so conflict-affected communities. So I'll really be speaking from the perspective of our work today, promoting what we call unarmed civilian protection as an area of practice. So how communities themselves protect themselves in a situation of mass violence through nonviolent means. Often when we talk about our work, the immediate reaction is, are you guys crazy? Like, it's very, why would you do that? Why would you, turn the other cheek, as we would say? So that's the first question that I want to address is why focus on our methods of self-protection? Why focus on nonviolence? For us, I think it really stems from a very clear recognition that traditionally protection is something that is viewed as coming from the outside. So from states, from peacekeepers, from other armed groups. It assumes that protection is something external, something that is provided to communities rather than something that comes from within. And of course, given the state of the world today, we've seen that there's clear limits to this kind of approach. One thing that we're usually pretty clear on is how power dynamics or power structures can lead to violence, or how it can create a system where people feel justified in using violence and perpetuating harm. But what we often overlook is how those same power dynamics and power structures also influence how we respond to violence, the tools that we resort to when we're faced with violence. And often it is through the use of force still. It's the same structures that underpin both the response and the origin of violence. So if you take the idea of accompaniment, for example, it's a common notion, I would say, in sort of the multilateral sphere, that foreign individuals, often white, or organizations can help prevent or assist Black and brown communities elsewhere in the world where violence actually persists. So it's really that usual typical global north, global south divide that we see. But here's the problem. This kind of perceptions, this kind of paradigm focus solely on the role of external actors. It assumes that the presence of outsiders, quote unquote, will save the day. And beyond the biases that underpin who will respond to violence, there's also the how, right? The how they act, the tools that they resort to, the ways in which they were equipped to respond to violence. And there again, we see that the default mode is to use force. It is still today seen as the most effective way to protect people when they are faced with mass violence. It is counterintuitive, or the counterfactual nowadays is that we've seen enough examples to show us that actually it often makes the situation worse. So this is why, basically, from our standpoint, we think it's important to rethink how we approach safety, how we approach security, especially in the context of armed conflict. So what we advocate for is civilian, non-violent-led protection, community-based. What we use the umbrella term armed civilian protection, because what it does is it offers a way forward that really puts the agency of those who are most affected by violence, those who need protection the most, at the center of our response. And that's really irrespective of cultural and political context. As we've seen, we have Latin America, we have the Middle East, we have Central and Eastern Europe. What I personally find fascinating with that approach is that it's really a paradigm shift in how we think about justice, whether even there's a need for justice, or a little bit like what you were saying, Azadeh, and the forms that it takes, right? When we decenter violence, what we do is we open space, we create the possibility for dialogue, and ultimately we interrupt the cycle. That is really why it's a strategy and why it's important, is that yes, you might not know eventually whether it leads to restoration, whether it leads to reconciliation, but at least you interrupt a cycle, a vicious cycle of violence. And that's what it's important. And so to move away a little bit from the abstract and maybe ground us more in concrete examples, I want to share a little bit about our work in South Sudan, working with women, since this is CSW Week, and share our work there with women protection teams. Women protection teams in South Sudan essentially kind of evolved from having been previously sort of prayer groups or women's collectives, and they evolved into dedicatedly focusing on the protection of their communities when the country started to experience mass violence around 2013. Essentially, what these women did is they really became key mediators within their own communities, started to deal with internal conflicts when those started to rise, especially as it relates to distribution of natural resources like water, which we know becomes very strained in the context of armed conflict. So here's an example from a POC camps, which is a protection of civilian camp in Juba. the capital of South Sudan, where women protection teams, for instance, noticed how fights over water were escalating and really sometimes causing serious injuries between individuals, but also their families, retaliation, etc. So they came up with a strategy to organize collection of water in a way that reduced conflict, dividing community members into groups. If you're in group A, you come get the water in the morning. If you're group B, you come get the water in the evening. And then when there's no more water in the evening, they'll lead really community mediation work to show that there's another way. We don't have to, physically fight for it. We can, there's other ways for us to deal with that situation. And so I think beyond that, the key idea here is not even just to show how women can be best or are well placed to protect their communities or themselves from internal or external threats, but it's also really how sort of their biggest added value is that they have a unique way where they can intervene into the fabric of the community to reduce violence, and how they can leverage the knowledge that they have of their own communities to reduce that violence. So it's really agency and strategizing, as we said. Nonviolence has nothing to do with being passive. It's actually a strategy, a proactive one. And so here I want to share as well some quotes that I take from our global head of advocacy and policy manager. Unfortunately, she's not here today. Her name is Dr. Felicity Gray. She wrote her PhD dissertation on the topic of unarmed civilian protection. And so she traveled in lots of places in the world where she interviewed many different people, but among which women, to ask them basically, about the work, about this approach, about this area of practice. And something really interesting that she tells in her dissertation is how women can actually leverage the very assumptions that permeate society about their gender. So the idea that they are weaker, that they are less threatening, to their advantage to promote nonviolence or interrupt cycles of violence. So it sounds counterintuitive, but it's a very powerful strategy. So I want to share a quote actually that comes from Myanmar, from a sort of project manager who worked with WPT, so women protection teams in Myanmar. And she shares how fascinating it was for her to see how actually women were able to bridge ethnic divides faster than anyone expected. So I'm going to read the quote. She says, "They are sitting and talking, and yes, they have all these ethnic issues, but they bridge those relatively fast, partly because, oddly enough, nobody takes women seriously. So they actually form much stronger glue at the community level because there's less interference in what women are doing. Basically, people don't care about what women are doing. And by the time people turn around, the women have actually moved a long way towards doing bottom-up ongoing protection." There's another quote from group, so civilian-led, and her work entails working with military authorities. So she also shares how she kind of leveraged her identity as a woman to get kind of to those peace dividends. So she says, so she's talking about her interactions with those military authorities. She says, "At first they were surprised, and after surprised, amazed. At the surprise level, they don't trust us. They don't trust me because as a woman, I am working in mediation and working in the conflict area. But in that time, when I had limited access, I treat them as a mother or as an elder sister or as a relative. I never showed them I was afraid of them. Actually, I was afraid of them. But I am just building an open approach. And there, they were convinced and actually quite amazed." So it's really interesting. Again, it's really that kind of disruption that we're talking about, where by defying kind of the expectations that people often have of women, they can actually be far more, effective than people might anticipate. And that's, I think, the whole premise of the work of Nonviolent Peace Force and why we promote community-based and community-led approaches that move away from the paradigm of force, is because we're saying, there's lots of different identities and entry points within a community, and people have sort of a kind of quiet power, and women exemplify that. There's ways they themselves see how they can use that, even the very assumptions that you have about them, to actually open up space and get to sustainable peace. They didn't need to rely on external forces. The UN didn't have to come in with a big peacekeeping mission, or they didn't need, international interveners. They really used just what was readily available to them, which is their relationships, their presence, collective action, but also really their identities for constructive agency. So one that can really get to sustainable reduction of violence. So we'll stop here, but I guess if there is one main takeaway that I sort of want to give to the group here is that really the basis of our work and what we believe is that you do not need to use force, you do not need to be armed, for instance, to be safe and to feel safe. That if you take time and if we take time to understand the context that we're in, there's plenty of sort of glimmers of hope or opportunities that arise for community-driven, dialogue-based approaches to handling violence, often than just relying on the use of force. So yeah, I will stop here. But,
So interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. There's so much to unpack with each of your remarks, and I wish there was more time. Maybe friends in the audience have some questions. I have a lot of questions myself. One question is, what would you say, and this is really to all or any of you, but what are kind of the thought processes involved because responding to injustice with violence or with the same injustice, somehow, like we've seen historically, that's been the kind of go-to method. So what are the thought processes involved in an individual or a community to actually break that? And if your government is unjust to you or another group is unjust to you, what are the thought processes involved to actually break that, even at the level of thinking? This could be from any of you. Felix.
I'll speak on the experience of Central America. The first response is because it does not work. In the case of my country, we produce a lot of history, more than the history we can consume. 70 conflicts from 1854 to 2018, which was the last massive civil conflict for a tiny country like Nicaragua. 350 people killed in less than 90 days, 55 of them students. And the protest movement, I think, that remained impressively nonviolent despite the provocations. But if we looked at our past history, whenever we had an oppressive regime that triggered a violent response, the next regime was more violent than the past. In fact, the dictator in Nicaragua today is Daniel Ortega, who was one of the leaders of the Sandinista revolution in 1979 that overthrew a right-wing military regime. And the Sandinistas, it's not me, it's the UN Senate in the last report by the UN UN Human Rights Council has created more human rights violations than the previous regimes. In other words, the so-called freedom fighters become the oppressors. So it's a cycle. And the only way to build a lasting democratic institutions is when you try to do, as a society, even as a member of the opposition, a different tradition. And I think that it's very hard because when you are abused, when you are offended, from expropriation to torture, from exile to arbitrary detention, the natural human response is to respond with violence. And that's why one of my papers talks about what I call the audit of the heart. If you are an activist, I think that many of the wounds, and I'm sure that Azadeh would agree with me, that are physical can be healed. But if you have a broken heart and you go as an activist full of desires of revenge, rather than being someone that will be a healer and that will try to create alliances, you will trigger a more violent response. So it's important to analyze those of us who are in this field that we deal with our own trauma. So that's what will be my first point. But a second, more controversial topic is that I do believe that in very unique circumstances, legitimate use of force, of course, can function. And once again, in the Central American experience, we see the Costa Rican revolution of 1948. It was a sort of a violent civil conflict that opened a new generation that decided to eradicate the army. So Costa Rica became the first Latin American country without an army, which was the result of a civil conflict. But that's an outlier. So you see some examples in which the legitimate use of force can lead to lasting institutions, but based on historical evidence, the cycle of violence seems to be the tendency.
I mean, Felix already sort of provided a comprehensive answer, but I guess just to quickly complement, maybe, I mean, the baseline ultimate, I think, realization is that violence feeds violence. And that's what's counterproductive, is that when violence is first initially spurred, what you're seeking is an exit, and you will never get to that exit if you feed the monster. If you feed it with more violence, you'll just keep on going. And we see that at different scales. We see that on the individual scales, community level, but also right now on the global scale, right? Conflict escalates. One country, does something, the other one wants to respond in a way that is seen to be the sort of legitimate same-scale response, but ultimately people suffer, and we don't see a way out. We don't see an end, a light at the end of the tunnel. So I guess that's kind of the sort of, it's almost people often view nonviolence and activism work as being very, moralistic and principled, but actually it's very rational. If you want to get out of a cycle of a vicious cycle of violence and conflict, you need to at least diversify ways and think about non-violent action modes. I mean, it's as rational as it gets, in my opinion, but yeah.
So I don't have anything to add, and I agree. But I think what happens is with violence, I think when we look at it in global area, we have to also think about, even in relationship when there is a violence, how can we end that when we erupt that cycle? Once we erupt that cycle, that's where change happens. And we have seen it. I mean, unfortunately, in Iran, we can't go to Iran and implement any of these because nobody is allowed. But we have seen it after South Africa, after the apartheid, what happened, when there were conversations about, which is hard to sit in front of someone that inflicted that pain, that actually executed your family member. But we saw the result that they did talk to each other, their pain was validated, and they moved on. So it is possible. However, I think is not the norm yet.
Katarzyna, please. Did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. So you ask about the thought process. So I would say that it starts with this thought that I want to do it. And then the question is why I want to do it. So in scholarship, we say that there are two approaches to nonviolence, or even two kinds of nonviolence. So one is principled and one is pragmatic. And the difference is that the principled is based on the thought that I want to do it because I feel that this is the right thing to do, because of my beliefs, because of my values, etc. So here, you even don't have to encourage people to do it, because they are doing it because they feel this is the right thing to do. Then pragmatic, the strategic nonviolence, that's the nonviolence that it's based on the thought and research that is showing us that nonviolent resistance and nonviolence is just more effective. And this is the huge research done by Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stepan, showing that nonviolent resistance is twice as effective as violent ones. So when you're choosing between, violent response or non-violent response, and you just see data, research is showing us, well, if you want to, be more effective, then you use non-violence. So here, what is important is education, because you have to know that, and not all people know that. Because if it's just based on your beliefs, then it's easier, right? You do it because you believe this is the right thing to do. But if your beliefs are not like this, and you just do things that are just effective, and you want to see the effects, the results, then you have to get the knowledge. You have to be, educated. You have to get data. That's why education is crucial. And the last argument for, using nonviolence, besides what, the other speakers said, and I totally agree, is that it's not just more effective, but if you don't want to see violence again in your community, in your country, then nonviolence is giving you this chance, because also research shows that when you are doing changes, making changes using nonviolent resistance, the chance of another, civil war or violence happened again is not as great as when you respond with violence. So it's not just, effective right now, but it also gives you a better chance for the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. I just wanted to see if there's any questions in the audience. There's some also virtually. Oh, sorry. You have a question as well. Okay, we'll take one from virtual and then we'll come to the room. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but Olgierd? I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. Can you hear?
Thank you.
Can you hear
I just
us?
got unmuted. Thank you. It is a great bliss and pleasure to be, and I'm very honored. And especially for the occasion of me completely being outside person, just to have a possibility to listen to your debate and even to take active part in it. And the agency is absolutely crucial for me, especially for those all the speakers told, and about the role of making the communication from bottom up. And that is my question, and about the continuing the topic of education and what Katarzyna Przybyła said about the university institution. Because as we look at it, as a social mission of it, it is all, it looks like completed from the theory point. But if we have a litmus test and how it makes the culture of debate, the situation of have oral equality, no matter of the gender, religion, race, and also on, and how it's really works. And it brings me the question if there is a possibility to really check, and from the scientific point of view, said that this society is driven by the non-violence communication model, and that's from bullying and terrorism and so on, to making the persuasion for force. And after that saying, I just start thinking about some kind of prototype and the situation of making the education a peace education fully promoted in the different labors of the citizen state. It means that you can just take a focus on making the environment for that social values and the participants really to act with it. And especially if we're talking in for the Bologna process and so on, can you really check from that perspective, from the peace study perspective? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution and for your participation. Dear Raj. Yeah.
I have a question for the panelists. I have a belief. I'm a Brazilian. I used to serve for 40 years at the Bahá'í community, defending the rights of the Bahá'ís in Iran. I retired and I was suddenly invited to work for a Black Woman Institute in Brazil. So my question regards racism. I believe that violence will end for good if we really transform human hearts. I mean, there's no other way. It will take a few centuries probably, but we will achieve it. But meanwhile, we have to do something. And my question to the panelists is, which is the best strategy to confront systemic violence, which doesn't inflict you any hurt on your arm, like Azadeh was saying. It doesn't bleed, but it bleeds inside. It bleeds inside when you're talking about racism or sexism. Women have been under this violence for millennia now. But I'm talking about the people of African descent in this part of the world where I am in Brazil, which were brought from Africa as slaves, and they are still bleeding inside. Which is the strategy that works to not being violent, but trying to end with a systemic perspective that the oppressor always inflicts. Oppressors are very smart. They change their strategies very quickly. I believe oppressors, they have a kind of a union or a syndicate that they keep on exchanging views amongst themselves because they suddenly change the way of oppression. So you think you're winning a game, but again, then you're losing again. In the twinkle of an eye, all that you women have achieved in the past 70 years is being lost very quickly. What is that? Whatever we were winning in terms of the strife against racism, we're also losing. So my question to the panelists is a very straightforward one, which is the strategy that meanwhile we can follow, while for the next century we will work on the human heart and change hearts, but we have to do something.
Yeah, I wanna take that very, very easy question. I mean, the first thing I thought when you explained your question was, well, actually, it's the quote that Katrina was sharing earlier, do not be indifferent. I think it's important to recognize, as you were saying, you mentioned the internal suffering that comes with being subject to structural injustice, structural violence that doesn't manifest in a way that people can actually recognize, right? And that sort of takes energy. It steals you from your personal energy. And I think it's important to recognize, therefore, that, it's a form of agency to not give up and speak the oppressor's language, right? So you may seem passive because you're, just standing and maybe it seems like you're bottling up, but you're actually responding and not responding, if that makes sense. So I think keeping that stance and refraining from speaking the oppressor's language is already a response. You're not being indifferent. You are resisting in that very way. You're resisting the temptation to see humanity basically, fall down even more than it already has. So I think that's important. I'm sure Azadeh also has some maybe advice in terms of, because there's a lot of limits to that. Like I guess there's ways in which you need to do that will still uphold your mental sanity so that you don't lose yourself. But I think not being indifferent and resisting is already one key. My second point is, and that thought came to mind as I'm an alum from Columbia University, and we might all know here what is going on right now with the student Mahmoud Khalil, who's been unlawfully detained by ICE at the moment, and despite the frustration that I deeply feel about the actual situation, what kind of moves me and what I am a deep believer in is collective action. I think understanding where you are, quote unquote, a victim, although I don't like that word, but where you maybe might not have the luxury of intervening and are subject to structural justice, but also where you can be an ally to other people who are doing that. So a little bit like all of us, I think, did today, where we are sharing quotes from people who might not have the means right now to speak up for themselves. That's another way of resisting collectively, right? If we all understand that we're part of the same fabric, where can I step in where you can't? I think that's one way to sort of mitigate, before we can all live in a world that's actually worth living in, to mitigate what we are experiencing today. Those are the sort of thoughts that I had in my mind when you were mentioning.
Thank you. I think we have a couple more questions we can ask, and then maybe we can answer everything together.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the panelists. This has been such a touching conversation, so I appreciate the vulnerability that I think is needed to have this type of an intimate, very honest conversation about difficult topics. I just wanted to ask, and I think it actually goes well with the questions previously asked. It was mentioned, and I think some of, or maybe all of you mentioned, the impact of generational trauma and how perhaps those that, like the children or the grandchildren of those that actively receive the trauma, then still feel those effects as it's passed down in the generations. And the complexity of that is that perhaps that person, the child or the grandchild, has a totally different life, different external circumstances, but internally somehow a similar, you know, that similar pain and bleeding that we mentioned. So I'm just wondering how is that grappled with? What is the research or the experience that talks about that?
Thank you. Actually, I was going to point that out because it's connected. And I think that one of the things that we can do is to spend more time and our resources on that generational trauma. I'm going to show you guys a story. I am Iranian. I was born in Iran, but I was raised in Sweden. And Sweden is a socialist country. Equality is highly valued. And I remember from a very early on around our dinner table, the conversations were very different. The conversation around dinner table was and I was exposed to that. However, when I would go to my Swedish friends, the conversation around that table was, how was your day, honey? What did you do? What are you going to have for breakfast? Where are we going to go shopping? So it was very, very different. And that set the tone of when we talk about generational trauma is that my parents had to uproot their life, come to a new country, learn the language, and was faced with a lot of racism. And then I was carrying that as a very young child. And then now I can see that I'm carrying through my children because my children at home are now exposed to this. They know that what woman life freedom is, and they know that there is a bad guy that killed Mahsa Jina Amini. So I think it goes back to that education at a very early on and teaching our children, teaching in schools, teaching in institution, that cycle we need to break that cycle. Otherwise, we have pockets of change everywhere. But however, when we have bullies and these bullies have big platforms, we're never going to reach that because at the end of it, everybody has a soul. Everybody has something that is going to move them. And believe it or not, 99% of when I talk to survivor of torture, there's one person that they always mention, and that's their mother. When they are faced with mock execution, those moments of silence, the moments that the life, just like a little video film of all their life, they only see that mother. So that mother tells us that what an important role that women have and how we can use those as agents of change. And I will encourage everyone, if you have an opportunity to speak, or if you have an opportunity, bring another woman with you. Pull that chair so they can also have a presence in that, because that's how we can see that change happening.
Thank you. Felix.
These are fascinating questions. I want to share some thoughts on your question on strategy. I think that the most important strategy of autocrats that want to trigger violence is what I call the otherness, basically dehumanizing the other and breaking the possibility of common ground. So in terms of tactics, it's one thing that we could do without putting skin on the game and putting our own lives at risk. As you know, Gandhi and Gene Sharp also said that nonviolence is a war without weapons. So you must be brave to put your life at risk. But what to do, if I understood correctly, your question, without going the length of putting yourself in the situation of being a political prisoner, for example. And I think it's a fascinating question because we do not have to think that you have to be at the front lines of a protest or even to sacrifice your life to be a nonviolent activist. You can be a nonviolent activist by cultivating common ground, by fighting polarization, by trying to trigger dialogue. I believe that this otherness, it's terrible, and social media in particular has been a very negative effect. If you look at the literature, many years ago on activism, there was a big hope that social media was going to be the great hope for activism. But actually, if you look at research, social media has contributed to radicalization, to polarization, and that is, of course, something that allows violence to trigger. I think that all great question on the role of universities is it's my field, but I'll try to be super short out of respect of time. 4 things the university can contribute to this dialogue. First of all is critical thinking, because violence thrives in the lack of dialogue. So when universities train their students, their researchers, their departments, their communities to pursue dialogue and critical thinking, autocrats and bullies are left without that space. So I think that critical thinking is a big contribution of universities. Number 2, tolerance. Universities historically, and in the US in particular, have been tremendous institutions to trigger diversity and inclusion by bringing international students, by promoting the studies of other cultures. Young students learn at universities, particularly those that focus on international programs, to really understand that the problems of someone in Africa or in Nicaragua are very close to the problems of their communities. So that's very important. And number 3, evidence-based research, which goes back to what Katarzyna mentioned on evidence-based. Universities can also support this research on nonviolence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll just end with Katarzyna, please.
Thank you. I will try to be brief. Conflict transformation and transforming human hearts, this is a long-term project, definitely. But there are some things you can do, today, because with the long-term projects, like you have to start today. So the first thing, and it was mentioned in a few other answers, it's this acknowledgement. So acknowledging that what is and understanding what is happening to you. So for example, acknowledging transgenerational trauma. That's the first step of like breaking the cycle and changing the power dynamics. Also acknowledging and understanding that what is happening to you is, for example, violence, because when you know what it is, then you can act. Another element, and it's supported by research, is that not just education, but also training. So working on skills is very beneficial for different social movements to, get more people involved, etc. But the last thing that I want to mention, and I know that it's often really underestimated and it's not very popular, but my thought is no dictator or oppressor had a happy childhood. What it means that it starts at home with our actions, towards our children, how we, care for them, if we spend time with them, if we talk to them, if we love them. So it starts at home. So we have to definitely think about the big picture and, international conflicts, global community, but it starts with our actions in our homes with people that are close to us. And this is what, conflict transformation and peace building means to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for a fascinating conversation, really so much food for thought. And hope you look forward to really continuing this discussion. Of course, an hour and a half is not enough for such a big topic. But thank you, and thank you all for participating. And we can feel free to have coffee, tea, continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's recorded.